Mr. Lunn, I've requested that you bring up exhibit number 295. It's a co-management discussion paper. In particular, I'd like the panel members to look at page number 5. There's a spectrum of engagement table, table number 1. And that table illustrates the spectrum of engagement in decision-making. I'm just reading from the top of the page here. The spectrum of engagement in decision-making, moving from centralized government management on the left to local community management on the right. I'd request that each of the panel members plot for me and tell me how you would plot the following programs along the spectrum. Essentially, beginning at the far left, there's informing and information exchange, and then advisory, partnership, shared management, and devolution. So beginning with the Pacific Integrated Fisheries Initiative, PICFI, where would you plot that along the spectrum? Beginning with Mr. Huber?
That's difficult. I think it crosses a number of the... I mean, this is, to start with this, just an example. There's different versions of this with the same idea, that moving from right to left, more authority or decision making. Of course, when the program started, there was a lot of information exchange and forming, and as we've moved along and developed the program, we get into more the partnership side, and First Nations, a part of that, working amongst themselves to figure out how, as a business model, it would work. So we're moving, I would say, to the right, and some of it's moved into the partnership side.
Where would you suggest it falls currently? You say it's moving more towards the right. Where does it fall currently?
Well, it's more than advisory in the sense that First Nations now, with their economic fisheries, are not only having built their business plans, they're doing the harvesting and they're doing the marketing, the fish. So they're making management decisions as far as a business operation.
Thank you. And Mr. Todd, where would you plot PICFI?
I've had very little involvement with the PICFI program, but I did participate in one project this past summer, and almost a year ago now. And so I would say, even with an active fishery, we were at the advisory stage.
Thank you. And Grand Chief Terry, where would you plot PICFI, sorry? Okay.
Well, from our approach, it permeates the whole spectrum, I would say, in terms of management or governance, right on through, depending on where our technical people are, our advisory groups, and so on and so forth, would be dealing with these matters and then relaying them along. And I know for us, I know that the program is coming to an end, I think, next year, isn't it? And for our interests are in being involved in developing an economic basis. So I guess we're at the governance end of things right now.
Okay. And Chief Jones?
Yeah, I think I'd say it's more at the advisory level, and it's important to recognize that there's different elements to the program. You know, there's a kind of a license, there's a access acquisition and distribution element, there's a co-management element, and there's a enhanced accountability, and there's one other element as well. So I think they all are a little different, but to a large extent, a lot of the program are Aboriginal programs, and so I know there was a recent midterm review of PICFI that was done by the I guess the evaluation directorate of DFO, and that in one recommendation that came out of that was more involvement by First Nations in the decision making, you know, around the PICFI program and how it's developed and designed. So I think there's a recognition too by government as well.
Okay. And the same question with respect to plotting where the Aboriginal Aquatic Resource and Oceans Management Program would fall, and if you'd like to plot that, Mr. Huber.
Our focus right now with the program is to build this foundation for engagement with the First Nations, and actually with First Nations and the recreational and commercial interests as well. So it's still in development, and we've made a lot of progress in the last year in the sense of aggregates of groups working together. The Lower Fraser, for example, 29 of the 30 First Nations have now formed an alliance. Off the mouth of the Fraser, the IMOG group has developed substantially, and the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance has been operating for a number of years. So basically we're still in the building block stage, but we're doing that together. So where it fits on that spectrum, again, I would say it's in several places between information exchange and partnership.
Thank you, Mr. Todd.
I'm not sure that the AROM program in particular lends itself to this, to trying to categorize it with this particular spectrum. I think this is kind of a little bit more aimed at the types of things that go on in terms of actual fisheries management decision-making processes, or other types of resource management decision-making processes. I would have to say that from my experience with the AROM program, it's a funding program, and it's not an operational program so much, at least where I'm involved anyway. So I guess what it is a combination of information exchange and advisory.
Thank you. And Grand Chief Terry?
Yeah, AROM is a funding agency or funding source that was augment the AFS, I would understand. And so if we're talking about it in terms of the ITO, much like the other one, PICFI as well, we'd have to look at it as a governing body and determine whether or not we play a role in there. And it's been a difficult one for the ITO to be involved in right now, because I think at least from my experience, and along with Barry, is that it's going to be a hard fit for the department to deal with on a nation by nation basis.
Thank you. Chief Jones, could you tell me where would you plot the Gwaii-Hannes Marine Agreement on the spectrum?
Well, that's not an ARM program.
Yes,
but I think it probably would fit more under the partnership shared management.
Thank you.
And I think under ARM, Haida Nation is involved also in marine planning, the Pensima area, and I'd say there we're in between advisory and partnership shared management, and I think there is kind of this structure, for Pensima, a government-to-government structure, and it took some time to put that in place. It took 5 years until we, finally there was an MOU signed that kind of established this governance structure. So I think that with the ARM program, it depends on the will of both parties, as well as the issue in terms of whether you can kind of get agreement on how to move ahead. And within the Fraser, I'd have to defer to my other colleagues in terms of their assessments.
Is marine agreement on that spectrum?
On the partnership or shared management.
Thank you.
And I'd say there are some instances like with the Gwaii-Hannes Watchman program, where I guess it still would fit pretty much under that same level.
Thank you. And Chief Jones, also the Kunst Agu and the Kunst Aya reconciliation protocol, which I understand is Exhibit 1200, where would you plot that on the spectrum?
I'd say it also would be more the partnership shared management level.
Thank you. Chief Jones, recognizing that 2009 was an anomaly, I'm just going to ask some questions with respect to annual catch. What percentage of the annual catch represents the First Nations share for each year since 1993? Are you aware of those figures?
The First Nations share?
What's the percentage of the annual catch that's represented by the First Nations share for each year since 1993. So if you look at if you look at exhibit number 493 at page 23, figure 15, it indicates the Fraser River catch by sector. So the question that I'm asking is, what percentage of the annual catch is represented by the First Nation share for each year since 1993? So that's 1992 to 2002. Sorry, in particular from 2003 to now. Would you know?
What the share is now?
Yeah.
I don't have those figures offhand. I have seen tables which try to describe that. I think I'd have to look back at this figure just to remind myself what the Canadian Aboriginal catch is, whether that's food social ceremonial, because then there's also pilot sales catch, in the Fraser, right? As well as there's some commercial catch in there. There are some First Nations, but that wouldn't be included, I'm sure, in these numbers.
Okay. So are you aware of figures that indicate the Canadian Aboriginal, the percentage of the Aboriginal catch as a percentage of the total catch?
Certainly for the food social ceremonial catch, those figures are available.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, go ahead, Mr.
Maybe I
Beard.
could help
Thank
clarify
you.
that a bit. The Aboriginal catch for the Fraser sockeye, if there's a relative abundance around, it's got more stability than the commercial catch because it gets first priority after conservation. So you're going to have years, and we've just gone through a number of years where we've had severe conservation up to last year issues for Fraser sockeye. So in those years, of course, with the commercial fisheries being closed, the percent of the harvest is going to be high. The harvest is going to be relatively small, but the percent of Aboriginal harvest, because of the priority, is going to be high. So just looking at reading percentages like that from year to year really doesn't give you a good comparison.
Thank you. Chief Jones, I'm wondering, with your work with and involvement with various First Nations, I'm wondering if you are aware of whether individual First Nations FSC needs are being met.
I know what we heard during the hearings from the First Nation panel was it wasn't being met in many areas. That was on the Skeena, on the Fraser, and even on the coast. And there was there's a variety of reasons, and I think we went into some of those reasons in the report.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, which report?
In our place at the table.
Thank you.
And then there's also, as I mentioned, there's a food social ceremonial work group that's set up under the Fishery Council, and that group has been meeting since last summer, right, to also try to scope out some of the issues and some of the policy issues, as well as other issues around that. And my understanding is that they've developed a work plan, but they haven't made much progress, I think, at addressing the substantive issues around the why those needs aren't being met in many cases, or in some cases.
Thank you. If I can just ask Mr. Lund to pull up our document number 38. So West Coast Central, thank you. I can go to page 258. There's a conclusion there. And Mr. Jones, Chief Jones, this is a question for you. The conclusion that's found at number 8, if I can just have a moment, please. Thank you. Just read this in. Co-managers have been successful in producing knowledge at different scales to better reflect local ecological conditions and coast-wide trends. Co-management has also provided for the production and integration of different types of knowledge and created institutional paths for the transfer of knowledge at different geographic and political scales. Essentially, and just reading down to the bottom of this paragraph, co-management has substantially enhanced the institutional fit of the management system, focusing fisheries managers in attention on a more expansive geographic region and on a more inclusive suite of impacts. This article, it references a Marine Policy 26, 2002, 253 to 259. It's authored by Saima A. Eben. And I understand that you have some familiarity with the Washington State fisheries.
Yes.
And with respect to the conclusion that's set out at number 8 that I've just read portions of into the record, would it be fair to say that you agree with this conclusion?
Yeah, in general, I'd agree. Co-management, does lead to better management, and part of it is because of better exchange of information and a more holistic view of a fishery. And I think in the case of Washington State, there, each of the 21 tribes who are part of the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, they manage their own fisheries, and they do that through their own local processes, even though there's agreement among them on an overall management plan, and so that allows them to bring kind of that knowledge into their local process. So that's an important part of effective engagement at local level is to kind of having often, like in our area, it's consensus-based decision. So we have public meetings and engage the people who are actually involved in the fishery and developing rules for the fishery, and it does lead to better compliance, kind of better information, as well as enhanced benefits from the fishery.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to how First Nations feed, with respect to allocations, how they feed their concerns regarding allocations into the Pacific Salmon Commission process.
I'd say that's not done very effectively at present, and it's partly because of the structure is not a kind of a representative structure. We're all the commissioners and panel members all appointed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I think it would be a much stronger process if there was that accountability, to Tier 1 processes, that were Tier 1 First Nation processes. But I think that going back to the kind of the example from the United States, on their side, the tribes, they work with the state and also the federal governments, and they also put forward names of people to be involved in the panels or the commission, and those are selected, by the federal government, but I think the fact that in most cases those are the same people who are put forward, by the tribal leadership.
Thank you. I understand that I'm out of time, but before I conclude, I'd just like to mark our document number 38 as the next exhibit, if that's possible, please. That's the document containing the conclusion, the article authored by Saima A. Eben.
To be marked as exhibit number 1223.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, it's Tim Dixon for the Stalo Tribal Council and Cham Indian Band. Mr. Lunn, I'd like to ask you to pull up Exhibit 1210, if you could. It's tab 28 on Canada's list, if that's easier. Yes, and if you could just scroll to the top of that, Mr. Lunn. Thank you. Now, this is one of the consultation records that was referred to last day by Council for Canada. Mr. Huber, if we look at this document, this is one of the tabs. It's Port Mann to Sawmill Creek, 2007. And if we look at this document just where it is on the screen now, I think we see that the first two entries, the January 23 entries, are both emails where DFO is providing information, I think, with respect to forecasts. Is that right?
That's what it appears to be to me. Microphone, please. That looks like that's correct, yes.
And then the next four, as I look at them, are entries recording phone conversations on a variety of topics, request for a first salmon ceremony, some kind of payment inquiry, financial reporting, and the like. Is that so? Those go February 21 through March 2, I believe.
And that's what it reads there. I didn't produce this document or give direction to the staff in that area.
Very well. And in the next four, when I look at them, they seem to be scheduling consultation meetings.
Yes.
And just by looking at it, this document appears to record all sorts of contacts that DFO has with First Nations. And my point is that not all of them are actual consultation meetings. In fact, if we look at here, a number of them are quite a lot more minor than that. Would you agree?
Well, they're not actual meetings, but they're keeping track. I mean, the department staff try to arrange meetings, and sometimes they have a difficulty in doing that. There's resistance from some First Nations to engage with the departments, but there's an obligation to consult, and there's an obligation. They don't. First Nation isn't forced to engage with the department, but the department has to make an honest effort, and the staff should be tracking that they're doing their jobs.
Right, and it's tracking all those contacts. And Mr. Lunn, if I could go to Exhibit 596, please. Mr. Huber, this will be the consultation with First Nations best practices guide. And Mr. Lunn, if we could go to electronic page 10, please. There's that box in the middle of the page, records of consultation, and it says this: it is very important to keep records of all letters, meetings, including attendance lists, telephone calls, site visits, and other efforts by the Crown to consult with First Nations at all stages of consultation. These are all considered to be elements of the consultation process, although no one element unto itself is considered full consultation unless the First Nation has agreed that it is. And the spreadsheet we were just looking at, the Excel spreadsheet, that's what that is, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. And the purpose of it is to track DFO's consultation efforts so that it can prove consultation if it needs to. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And as this best practices document suggests, to me anyway, it's not clear what actually constitutes consultation. And I want to ask you about that, if I can, by going to an observation that Ms. Gartner made in her Fraser Watershed Process paper, and that's, Mr. Lunn, that's Exhibit 1207. Ms. Gartner is going to have to suffer some embarrassment while I read her work. And to page 10, please. And that paragraph 1A, Ms. Gartner noted that there is a significant lack of clarity at both First Nations meetings and DFO First Nation meetings regarding such principal matters as intentions, goals, agendas, mandates, representation, and function. It's not clear whether a particular meeting is serving an information gathering, advisory, or decision-making purpose. This lack of clarity breeds distrust, unspoken and conflicting agendas, increased unwillingness to participate, in fear of what it will be used for, and irritants such as too many meetings to attend, which do not have meaningful or concrete results. And do you agree with those broad observations?
This was written back in 2004, I believe.
Yes.
And I would think the department's doing better today, but there's lots of room for improvement, and this is why we're working and expending a lot of resources to build this co-management, this foundation, these types of agreements that will help clarify this. This is often a challenge for departmental staff to know when there's been enough consultation or adequate consultation, or with agreements on how to go about that. And in our partnership relationship, consultation can actually become embedded in the process, and it won't be near the issue.
Yes, and from what I hear from your answer, then you'll agree that more clarity and a more structured process is desirable.
And we are attempting to do that, and we have made improvements.
Mr. Todd, I'd like to open this up to the panel. Do you share Ms. Gertner's concerns, and maybe you could comment on Mr. Huber's response?
Yes, I have and do share those very same concerns with the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat and the proliferation of initiatives that were being funded through the Secretariat by the department. All very well-meaning, but there was certainly some growing pains, and that was a fairly major initiative of mine last summer and fall and in the winter, was to actually try to bring some clarity to these various initiatives by drafting terms of references for each one and trying to more accurately describe sort of what the purpose of the initiative was and how it was going to be carried out and under what sort of, not rules, I guess, but sort of terms of engagement. So I do agree with Mr. Huber that there is progress being made on that front.
Thank you. I want to turn now, if I can, to the food fishery. On Monday, as some of you know, because some of you have commented on it, Professor Harris testified that the restriction on the sale of Aboriginal food fish is a legal construct, and he noted that the enforcement of the ban on sales is difficult, intrusive, and the source of considerable antagonism between Aboriginal peoples and the federal government. And he testified that a better regime is a straightforward allocation of fish without a restriction on use. And I think I've heard some support perhaps from the right-hand side of the panel, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Huber with some questions on that. But if any of the three of you would like to comment, now's an opportunity. If you want to comment further, and if not, I'll go to Mr. Huber. If nobody jumps up, then I'll go to Mr. Huber.
So sorry, just before you do there,
Yes.
I lost the thread there that you were asking us to comment on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my apologies. So the comment was that the restriction on the ban of sales of food fish is a source of considerable tension, uses a lot of resources, very difficult to enforce, and that a better approach, in Professor Harris's view, is a straightforward allocation of fish without a restriction on use. Mr. Todd?
I agree with Mr. Harris wholeheartedly.
Anybody else? Mr. Jones?
Yes, I think that the representation that is made by Mr. Harris goes to a great distance in, reaching the understanding that we have is that we do have the authority to make decisions on how we use our fish.
And I agree too that it's an impediment to kind of working together. And an example would be the communal licenses that the department issues to First Nations. Usually those aren't mutually agreed, and that's one of the major irritants. Is that there's a complete prohibition, on sale, and by agreeing to that license, you're agreeing to this, which in some cases is an Aboriginal right, but there's no discussion really of the, kind of those kinds of issues with the department. It seems like more of an arbitrary decision by the department, both about an allocation and also the use.
Mr. Huber, this morning Mr. Lowe's was complaining of the prosecution of the fishermen who protested the pilot sales program by fishing illegally, and that his reference there is to the CAP case. Is that your understanding?
Well, there's been a fair number of prosecutions over the year. I'm not sure if it was the CAP case. There's been, the Survival Coalition and others, I guess, have had these protest fisheries. They've gone through the courts.
Yes, there's been a series, and the most prominent of which has been the CAP case. And I understand that John Cummings, the former member of Parliament, was recently fined $200 for his involvement, and that he and the others intend to appeal that fine. Do you know anything about that?
No. But I mean, we're in Canada. People have a right to protest one way or another, but the government is responding to the courts. It's responding to building our relationship with First Nations and finding ways to settle issues. So if it's a question whether the government acted lawfully, I believe the courts have verified that the government has.
I suppose Mr. Lowe's point when he was bringing this up is that prosecution strains relationships with the department.
Definitely, with anybody, that's a negative way to deal with issues.
Yes, and we've seen that on the First Nations side, I believe, where substantial enforcement attention is given to Aboriginal fisheries in respect of the ban on the sale of FSC fish. And that's correct?
And it will continue until we resolve the issues of allocation and shares and get some of these settlements in place.
Yes, and on that, you agree that the enforcement of the ban creates a great deal of antagonism and uses substantial DFO resources?
Of course, it does.
And as Grand Chief Terry stated this morning, if the fish is caught legally, then what's done with it, whether it's used for food or whether it's sold, has nothing to do with conservation. You'd agree with that?
Well,
My friend's question, first of all, implies an assumption, and secondly, implies an assumption that is wrong. Presumably, if the license says that fish are to be harvested for, but not for sale, and the fish are harvested for sale, it is not caught legally.
If there's an allocation.
Perhaps my friend can define what he means by fish caught legally.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Appreciate that. So if there's an allocation that allows the fish to be caught, it's an FSC fish. What is done with it, whether it's sold, whether it's eaten by that person, by that community, it doesn't raise a conservation concern. You'd agree?
it wouldn't if it's within the allocation or the management plan, if it's accounted for.
And so, I think as you suggested a moment ago, would you agree that it would be constructive to move toward an allocation regime for Aboriginal fisheries that does not restrict the use of fish, that removes that source of tension?
I've dealt with many Aboriginal groups, and some of them want their FSC allocation kept separate. Some of them are afraid that in the future, if it's just open, that the community members will lose the cultural aspect in that. So there's support for separating the two. So, but in my mind, that's something that should be negotiable with the First Nations. When we talk about governance and authority, that comes into play.
I appreciate those comments. I want to turn to another topic, which is co-management. And Mr. Lunn, I'd like to bring up Exhibit 295, if I could. Thank you. And it's page 8 that we're going to. It's there's a diagram that I'm looking for. It's a couple pages down, a few pages down. That's the one. Mr. Jones, what this diagram shows, I believe, is that, as the caption says, it's opposing strengths of authority for First Nations and DFO. And on the left, I think it's intending to indicate that strength of authority on the Aboriginal side is highest at the more local level, and the opposite is true on the government side. And so the mandates are sort of coming from different directions. One's bottom up, one's top down. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a mismatch, and this is, again, it shows Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and so other organizations like, for instance, Parks Canada,
Right.
you have different structure.
Right. Yeah, I shouldn't have said government, DFO. And Mr. Lunn, if we go over to the next page, just at the bottom, there's a comment in the paper, Mr. Jones, that says that one way to overcome this challenge is through the development of common Tier 1 forums, which bring together First Nations within a more broad spatial area. And I take it the paper here is stressing the importance of these Tier 1 processes, because always the ultimate authority is going to remain at the First Nation level because they're the rights holders. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. And by bringing First Nations together, to work together, it makes there's a mismatch, between the DFO decision making and First Nation decision making. So it does help to address that mismatch.
Yes. Mr. Huber, last day, Mr. East was asking you about this and sort of indicating that DFO wanted to engage with First Nations at as large an aggregated level as possible. And I believe that you replied by expressing your agreement with Grand Chief Terry's vision of co-management with Aboriginal nations in a larger sense, as opposed to individual First Nations. Do you recall that?
I do, but just to clarify, you can have a larger area, aggregate such as the forum, where you're there to exchange information and to create an understanding, and we can get highly skilled technical people in attendance. We can't ask these people to travel around to every community,
Right.
but you not only get those kind of skilled people there, it helps build capacity with the First Nations, technical people, and for them and everybody to hear the issues. So we get a good understanding and a good grounding of what the issues are, and so it sets the stage for better decision making.
Mm-hmm.
The question with Saul, when you referred to it, Saul, there was his vision that the authorities at the nation level,
Yes.
and the support for that would be, of course, often the nations have 4, 6, 8, 10, sometimes more First Nations members.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a more efficient way to get things done, and it ensures, in my mind, another assurance that there's groups are working together.
Yes.
So the more communications, the more effective we can do that, the better.
Yes, and the point I want to get to here is that I think it's important to keep in mind that co-management won't work if DFO sits back and demands that First Nations aggregate up to the provincial level. My point is that DFO has to respect the source of Aboriginal authority. It's got to strive to find a workable solution within this dynamic of opposing
I
levels
fully
of
agree
authority.
with that, and
Right.
that's what we're trying to do.
Yes.
That's why we'd like Chief Terry to participate with us
Yes.
in building this.
And Mr. Jones, on this topic, I just want to follow up on one of Mr. East's questions from last day. He suggested in one of his questions to my ears that this internal Tier 1 organizing is for First Nations to work out for themselves. And I was reminded of your discussion of the Bolt decision, that once Judge Bolt found that the tribes had a right to manage their fisheries, the tribes were able to come together over time to work together. And my question is whether you see it as important, perhaps as essential, that DFO come forward and send a clear message that it is prepared to share decision-making authority, to recognize First Nations concurrent authority in the management of the fisheries.
Yes, absolutely. I think you have to have the political will, and that has to be communicated. And I think the other important part is providing the incentives for First Nations to be involved. And I think it goes beyond, kind of the involvement in decision making or the access to food, social, ceremonial fisheries. It also has to involve other incentives like economic access.
Mr. Huber, it strikes me that it would be a tragic result if at the end of the roadmap process, Ottawa decided it wasn't comfortable with the joint management arrangement that had been worked out by the parties in that process. Would you agree with that?
We will engage with the Ottawa staff. We wouldn't be agreeing to something that Ottawa is not going to agree to. We'll have the communications. And we'll know before we get to that point whether we can reach an agreement or not.
Yes, and
But obviously Ottawa is going to have to support it.
right. And how will that take place? Will that be transparent to First Nations in the process?
We will engage with at appropriate times senior officials, and including inviting them to participate in the process.
And I know that earlier in your testimony you said that it's best to let the roadmap process develop and not be too positional at this stage. I think that was your word, positional.
That's right.
Yes, but isn't it essential for First Nations to come together into the process to have a clear statement from Canada that it's willing to engage in the joint management?
That's helpful, and it's important that they lay their interests on the table.
Yes, all sides have to lay their interests on the table.
Yes.
And it's important in this process for Canada to lay its commitment to joint management on the table.
Well, in my mind, there's a difference between laying your interest on the table and being positional about. In the past, and that was one of the failings of the earlier watershed agreement, many people took strong positions, and some of the leaders took very strong positions, and later on, as things evolve, it's very difficult to back away from those positions. So I think that's an important lesson.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Oh, sorry, grant you to.
Yes. I'd just like to add that I think it's important to understand why it's important, I feel, to recognize our respective nations in the interests of the issue at hand here, in terms of why is the resource disappearing. Our nations are concerned for that because currently we've looked at the management for 20, 30 years and experienced much of the firsthand the curtailment of access to the resource in the name of conservation. We believed that it was for the purpose of conservation, but you know, when you lay out your harvest plans, who's there to really benefit from this? And it certainly has not been our peoples. But if there is indeed now a shortage of stocks, and they continue to diminish, I think in spite of last year's efforts, or returns, that is, not efforts, but returns that were in greater numbers for a certain sector of the watershed. Much of the other parts of the watershed continue to suffer shortage of returns of stocks of salmon. So in our opinion, as in the Intertribal Fishery Treaty, we say that that there needs to be a close look taken of how management has been done. And we believe there needs to be a change. And how does then the ITO or the implementation of that nation-to-nation treaty of ours fit into this process in order to facilitate a regeneration of stocks that come to or through our territories? We think that's critical, because our nations are intimately familiar with our various territories, our homelands. we are aware of all the waterways and habitats and anything and everything that affects the fish. And in terms of policy making, for example, the wild salmon policy, within the wild salmon policy, they refer to conservation units, and they generally are watershed based. And when you look at our nation's boundaries of our territories, they generally are watershed based. You can almost see the watersheds as they come to or through to the main stem, for example, of the Fraser or the Thompson or the Columbia. And so I think that that our nations then could be looked at as the conservation units that could be made operational in order to more practically work with the not only in terms of I guess the habitat and making certain that there's certain matters that don't affect for forest activities or other industrial activities can be managed and observed within the territory, and we have our people there that can and have and are doing that even today. And so I think that the importance, I just wanted to make certain that there's an understanding of why it is we emphasize that we need recognition and respect for that, the entities of our nations. Not only do we have vested interest as these as our homelands, but we need to re-energize or regenerate stocks and lands and resource issues within our territories, and fish is one of them. And I think too, because of the economic situation these days, Mr. Huber indicates that budgets are being cut to the bone, if not beyond. And we think that in the nation-to-nation process that we're putting forward, that there can be a more practical use of meager dollars, and because we would be there would be not as much a need to pull leaders from right across the province and come together month after month, but you'd have a smaller number that are mandated to address particular issues, and then they are responsible for returning the message then back to their respective nations. And I think that these are just a small sample of what I think is why it is that it's important to look at a more intimate involvement by our nations within the management of the fisheries, so that we can bring back greater numbers of fish to our people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, Lisa Fong for Heiltsuk Tribal Council. With me are my co-counsel, Ms. Ming Song and Mr. Benjamin Ralston. Mr. Lunn, if we could start with pulling up Heiltsuk document number 59, please. My questions are for Mr. Huber. Thank you. Mr. Huber, can you see the screen? Thank you. Now, this document is entitled Draft FSC Access Guiding Principles, and if I can have Mr. Lunn pull us into the next page. I'm just going to read certain portions before I ask you the question. You'll see the heading, Background for First Nations consultation sessions. In response to the Pierce-McCrae report, the First Nation panel on fisheries was established, with representatives appointed by a steering committee made up of leaders of the First Nations Summit and the BC Aboriginal Fisheries Commission. Now I'm going to drop down to halfway through that paragraph, 7 lines down, where it reads, in addressing these tasks, the panel engaged with First Nations across BC and worked with the visions, ideas, and information to develop the report, Our Place at the Table, First Nations in the BC Fishery. Now I'm going to drop down to the second full paragraph. Fisheries and Oceans Canada responded to this report in April 2005 with an action plan, which contained the following commitment to First Nations regarding FSC access. Food, Social, and Ceremonial Fisheries, DFO will work with First Nations to address concerns regarding fisheries access for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. Mr. Huber, that's part of the commitment, correct?
What it reads.
Yes, I'm sorry, can you just speak into your...
That's what it reads, yes.
Yes, and then in addition, for the longer term, the department will work with First Nations to develop a mutually agreeable framework for negotiating appropriate levels of fisheries resources for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. So that's another part of that commitment, a mutually agreeable framework. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this document later to ask you some questions. For now, could I get this marked as the next exhibit, please?
It's going to be Exhibit 1224.
Mr. Lund, if you could pull up our next document, which is HELTSIC document number 75. Thank you. Mr. Huber, this document is entitled First Nations Access to Fish for Food, Social, and Ceremonial FSC Purposes. You'll see it's dated May 2nd, 2006, and it's in PowerPoint form. Do you recognize this document as part of the work that was done for the action plan that was referred to in the previous document?
Well, I may have seen it. It doesn't look familiar when I look at it on the screen.
Okay, well, we'll go a little farther into the document then. Mr. Lund, if you could forward us to, let's go to frame 3 or page 3. And I'm going to refer you to the second and third bullet under the heading background. Now, the second bullet reads, fisheries managers were frequently asked to increase FNFC allocations or expand fishing area without an analytical framework or clear administrative framework. Now this is, again, we're in 2006. Did you understand this to be a problem?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm going to read the third bullet. Has led to ad hoc decisions, confusion, disparities among First Nations, and inconsistencies between AFS and treaties. Did you understand at that time that that was the feedback you were getting from First Nations?
I could see that.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. And now if we could forward to the next page, entitled Drivers for Change. And I'll just refer you to that first bullet, or the first paragraph. It reads, FSC allocations are considered inadequate and inequitable by many First Nations. And again, Mr. Huber, was that the message that DFO was getting from First Nations?
Yes.
Thank you. And now if we could forward to the next page, driver number 3. Now, driver number 3, if you just read that, my understanding of driver number 3 is the commitments which I referenced in the previous document. In other words, the commitment of DFO to work with First Nations to address FSC access and also to develop a mutually agreeable framework for FSC access. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And now if we could forward to the next frame and then go past the next frame and onward to FSC access strategy components. Thank you. Now, these components, I'm going to take you to what I believe are the documents for items 2, 3, and 5. So, Mr. Lund, if you could assist us, and I'm sorry, I'm missing my document here, but the operational framework is HELTSIC document 31. Okay. Whoops. Yes, thank you. If you could have them up at the screen at the same time, that would be helpful. Mr. Hubert, do you recognize this document that reads First Nations access to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, Part 1, Pacific Region Operational Framework, as being the corresponding document to Item 2 in that PowerPoint, the operational framework?
There was a lot of work done on that. I certainly recognize the document on the right.
Okay, so it could be a version of the operational framework that this PowerPoint would give a
Would be
presentation
referencing
on.
it, yes.
Okay, so again, let's go farther into the document. I'll ask you some questions. If we could go to page 4, please. Okay, sorry, because I'm missing my document here. Okay, I'm just going to read that first sentence. These are confidential internal DFO documents. Sorry, okay. Exempt from access to information requests. They define DFO's negotiating envelope with respect to AFS agreements, including, and this is important, maximum allocations for some fish species and funding levels for each agreement. And then if we drop down to 1, 2, 3, the third paragraph with the subparagraphs to it, you'll note it says, the following general guidance applies with respect to AFS fish mandates. Mandate species include sockeye. So these are my questions for you. My understanding in reading this is that first, these AFS mandates are not disclosed to First Nations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then second, the AFS mandates include a maximum allocation for fish species. Is that correct?
We generate a number, yes, and I participate in that for the areas I operate in.
Okay, and that for one of those species, it's sockeye.
Yes.
And so putting that together, what it means is that there's a maximum allocation for sockeye that's an AFS mandate.
Well, it's a maximum at the time. Annually, we'd review those mandates and adjust them. I've had them changed different times myself.
Right, but the point being that there's one for sockeye.
Yes.
Okay, and then third, if I read this correctly as well, there's an AFS mandate including maximum funding levels for AFS agreements.
That's right.
Okay, and I see that we're at 3:01 right now. Would this be an appropriate time to take a break? Or I can keep going?
Yes, you can keep going. That's fine.
Thank you. So for clarity then, taking that information, as I understand it, the quantity of FSC fish represented in the AFS agreements may be less than what is the maximum mandated quantity.
That's correct.
Okay, and again then, it's the same thing with the funding, right? In that the funding for AFS agreements may be less than what the maximum mandated funding is.
It could be, although what's happened is because AFS funds haven't changed since, in fact, they've actually been reduced by 5%. There's not much room. We're at the maximum. If we're changing a mandate, it means taking money from one group and giving it to another.
Okay, but these mandate numbers for funding and for FSC fish are not disclosed to First Nations, correct?
That's right. There's a negotiation that takes place, and I'd be one of the first to defend that policy.
Okay, and to this day, that's still what occurs. It's not disclosed to First Nations.
That's right. There's a good reason for that.
Okay, and let's get to your good reason. Am I right to say that DFO's rationale for not disclosing this mandated information, the secret mandated information, is so that during the negotiation process, it's got the ability to give and take in its negotiation, to give and take from one nation to a different nation?
Well, not from one nation to another nation. It's if I go to the table to negotiate, I want whoever I'm negotiating with to know that I'm the negotiator. If I just lay the maximums out, they're going to start with the maximums, and then I can't move, and then they're going to say, well, send the next guy that can change those numbers. I want to go in there with something to negotiate with, and I've negotiated many agreements with First Nations. Their negotiators also come to the table with things they want. It may be wording agreements, it may be funding, it may be fish numbers. So their negotiator and ours needs flexibility, and they have to have he's got to take something back to their communities to show that he's made some gains too. So there's, that's the way the process works. And
How very interesting, because I wonder, given your discussion about building trust and having a Tier 1 process for First Nations to come together and make decisions on their own and then come to Tier 2, how about another way of doing this, which is put all your cards on the table so that you have the trust and you build the trust, and then work from there on the hard issues, because you can have trust and work on hard issues. What about that kind of a process where there's just equal information on the table?
if we get to where the allocations are defined, that will work.
So let's get back to these secret mandates, though. And I don't know, I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment, because I don't know if I'm going to draw an objection from your counsel, so I want to give him an opportunity to make the objection. So today, currently, in relation to maximum mandated quantities of FSC fish, okay, how is that coverage organized? And what I mean by that is, are AFS mandates organized by particular species or particular regions, subregions, or tribes? So one moment.
Mr. Commissioner, I think we're starting now to cross into an area that's being covered by the submissions that we have before you on the issues of what the mandates are and what they cover, and the actual substance of those mandates. And we object on that basis, and you have our submissions on that.
I'm content to rely on our written submissions, thank you. And with that objection, I'm also going to ask the same question, but in relation to the funding, and I will acknowledge my friend will make an objection, and we will both rely on our written submissions.
Maybe
Thank you.
Could I just clarify a point? I did say something that... I can't clarify a point?
I'll let your counsel...
I was mindful of my comment the other day when I said something will work. I should say it may work. I mean, it's a negotiation and we work together to find solutions, but, saying something will may be a little presumptuous.
Now, Mr. Len, if we could go to page 8 of this document.
Tab 31.
This is the yes, that's right, the one on the right side of the screen. Okay, Mr. Huber, page 8 is part 3 of this operational document, and it reads roles and responsibilities of managing FSC access. And under general issues, it reads, this section describes a process for addressing requests for an increase in allocation or a change in fishing location. Stop there, and if you drop below to sub 4, one of the 6 different types of requests that address is change to a fishing area, permanent or temporary. And now, Mr. Lund, if you could take us to page 12. Okay, so page 12 has a sub 4 matching the heading, which I just referenced you to, changes to a fishing area, permanent or temporary. And I won't ask you to read it all. It's the process for the steps to be taken when an area manager is asked this question by First Nation. But I will ask Mr. Lund to flip to the next page. And the part I'm interested in this next page is the heading in the middle. It's accounting for catch outside the normal fishing areas. And it's that second hard bullet, which I will call the accounting rule. In other words, what happens to the fish that a First Nations catches outside of its management area? Where does it get counted, with the host nation or the guest nation? So, according to this, if members of one First Nation are fishing in the fishing area of another First Nation without a CLTA, and that's, I understand, to be a communal license temporary amendment, they must be designated by host First Nation and conform to the conditions set out in the communal license of the host First Nation. And here's the count. Their catch is counted against their own First Nation's allocation if they have an allocation for the species or stock being harvested. If the guest First Nation does not have an allocation for the species or stock they're catching, the catch is counted against the allocation of the host First Nation. So based on this particular regime, my understanding is that it works this way. If the guest nation has the species in their own communal license, then the fish they catch outside of their management area is then counted against their own number. But if they don't have that species in their communal license, then it's counted against the host nation numbers. Is that correct?
That's what it reads, and the host nation would need to agree to that. They may not agree that that's going to come off their allocation, and as such, they wouldn't be they wouldn't get approval to fish there.
Right,
Or
but
should.
assuming, realistically, it probably never happens without an agreement between
Yes,
nations.
yes.
So now we're really talking about when there is an agreement, what happens to those numbers. Okay, so what I'd like to understand is, my understanding is that this is no longer the rule. Is that right?
Well, I haven't dealt with this situation personally on the Fraser. So what is your new understanding?
Oh, my current understanding is that there is no such flexibility. It doesn't matter whether the guest nation has the species in their communal license or not. It is one solid red line rule that says the numbers are counted off the host nation. That's my understanding. Does that
To be
accord
honest,
with?
I'm not up on that, although I should be. I'm participating on the FSC working group, and as Russ said, we've got a lot of progress to be made, but we are looking at those issues.
Okay, so when you said you negotiate a lot of agreements, and I'm assuming that also means AFS agreements,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay, so when you negotiate AFS agreements, do you disclose to First Nations these sorts of fishing out of your area rules in advance of making the deal?
Yeah, well, the groups I've dealt with on the Fraser, that hasn't been, an issue. But I know it's more of an issue. What's really prompting this a lot is in a lot of the First Nations areas, the stocks they used to fish are in decline. So they're, in an effort to conserve them, they don't have access to those stocks. So they're looking at fishing other stocks, such as Fraser salmon. So this has created a situation where there's, more of this need to access fish in other areas.
Right,
So
and
it's-
have you heard about the coastal concern, which is that the Fraser River sockeye run past the coast before there's any test fishing that's done down in the south, and so there's that timing problem. The fish have gone by the time they know there's a giant run. So what do they do then? Perhaps they can fish outside of their management area, and I'll bring that up later. But do you recognize that as being another
Yes.
problem?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like that document exhibited, please, the one on the right.
Ms. Fong, before you proceed to that, did you wish to mark tab 75 and 31?
Yes, please, thank you.
Okay, perhaps we'll do that first. Tab 75 will be marked as 1,225. And tab 31 will be marked as 1,226. And the tab you just mentioned is? Oh, that is 31. Okay, good, we're good, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Lunn, if you can bring down the document on the right, leave the PowerPoint up on the left, and bring up document number 32, Health 6 document number 32. Thank you. Mr. Huber, now this is a document that's entitled Part 2 Pacific Region Evaluation and Decision Framework, and it's got that same front page as the previous document. Do you, by any chance, recognize this, now referencing back to our PowerPoint, as being item number 3?
Well, there were so many documents and iterations of this. I'm sure I've seen, this.
Okay.
Whether I've seen this specific document.
Okay, and we'll go into the document and see if you recognize the principle. If we can go to the next page of the evaluation framework, thank you. So under background, it reads, the FSC Access Evaluation Frameworks were developed to improve consistency of how FSC access requests are addressed, while also providing flexibility to address the unique considerations of each Aboriginal group. Did you understand way back in 2006 that this would be the goal of this evaluation framework, to improve consistency, but at the same time have flexibility because you recognize that First Nations are different?
Well, that was my understanding.
And would you be able to say that it is DFO's approach that they recognize there's not one rule that fits all for First Nations because they are different?
That's true.
this be a good time to take a break?
Yes, thank you.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.